Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be tackling the latest proliferation financing challenges with our excellent panel of experts. My name is LaDan Archin. I'm a managing director from K2 Integrity. I'll be moderating the panel today. Today's webinar is hosted by the Institute for Financial Integrity, which works to empower the professional community to protect the global financial system through cutting-edge research, education, and training. It's very encouraging for us to see so many of you joining us from all over the world. And so for that, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. We appreciate that you're taking time out of your day today to come together to share knowledge, and we hope that you gain value from today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be sure to share the link with you to revisit or share with your colleagues after the event is complete. We also encourage you to, encourage your comments and questions. You'll see a Q&A tab on the console on the right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar for us to answer live in today's discussion. You'll also note that there is a tab called Docs. That includes a few documents we've uploaded for your reference during today's discussion. After today's event, you'll receive a follow-up email, including the link to the webinar recording, as well as other information for your further reading. To start the webinar and to make sure that we have a mutual understanding of the fundamental term being used here, we'll rely on the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, definition of proliferation financing, which defines it as providing financial services for the transfer and export of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, their means of delivery, and related materials. It involves, in particular, the financing of trade and proliferation-sensitive goods, but could also include other financial support to individuals or entities engaged in proliferation, in other words, revenue raising as well. Right now, we're at an interesting juncture in the counter-proliferation financing journey. Less than 2 years ago, FATF added the requirement for conducting PF risk assessments to Recommendation 1 and issued guidances, and has stepped up the technical compliance and effectiveness assessments of CPF in its mutual assessments. This has resulted in many jurisdictions and entities producing PF risk assessments, most of which are based on the same FATF Recommendation 7, which focuses on UN sanctions on Iran and DPRK. That is UN Security Council Resolutions 2231 and 1718. However, in the past 6 months, the Russian Federation has vetoed a renewal of UN sanctions against Iran's ballistic missiles and UAV program, which is that UNSCR 2231, as well as a resolution extending the mandate of the UN panel of experts monitoring the sanctions on North Korea, while at the same time it's importing Iranian and North Korean UAVs and ballistic missiles for use in its war against Ukraine. So Russia's vetoes have effectively dismantled the multilateral sanctions framework on Iran and abolished multilateral sanctions monitoring capabilities for North Korea. But the Iran and DPRK PF risks haven't gone away, perhaps even heightened. Plus, there are other PF risks to consider, which we'll discuss today. This webinar will focus on the heightened proliferation financing and sanctions risks now facing the private sector and the private sector given this new landscape, and we'll discuss some of the red flags and typologies and the challenges for the private sectors, especially in UN sanctions-only jurisdictions. Joining me today is Julia Hersonsky, who is a senior advisor for strategy and planning at the Office of Export Control Cooperation at the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation at the U.S. Department of State. Also from State Department, same bureau, ISN, is Charlie Brewer, who's the Deputy Team Chief of the Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction, or CTR. And we're delighted that Hugh Griffiths is joining us. He is the former coordinator for the UN panel of experts. You can learn more about our experts in the bio section in the bio section here. All right, so the first question, over to you, Hugh. As a former coordinator for the UN panel of experts, or UNPOE, and someone who has been involved in the monitoring of the implementation of the UNSCRs on Iran and DPRK, can you please give us what you think of the current state of play and what the challenges you think are? Thanks.
Thank you so much, LaDan. Well, What is happening today, even as we speak, is that the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, once responsible for upholding global non-proliferation and counter-proliferation finance norms, is now supporting, through direct finance and other means, the development of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, related technologies in both North Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Russian Federation is using the resulting UN prohibited transfers of ballistic missile technology from North Korea to the Russian Federation against civilian targets in another UN member state, Ukraine. Put simply, that Russia is launching North Korean missiles at European cities in an attempt to terrorize civilian populations would have been unthinkable just 3 years ago. While at the same time, and for considerably longer, the Russian Federation, using its status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has been leading the way in blocking North American, European, Japanese, Republic of Korea, other G7 multilateral efforts at the UN Security Council in New York. The Russian Federation have been blocking the efforts to update UN sanctions designation lists or other measures to better enforce the very UN sanctions on North Korea and formally applied to Iran that Russia had previously agreed to at the UN and enshrined in its own national laws, signed as presidential decrees by Mr. Vladimir Putin. So Mr. Putin's actions, his invasion of Ukraine, his ballistic missile cooperation and procurement from Chairman Kim pose really dire consequences for both European and global security, but not least for the private sector banks, insurers and others now operating in jurisdictions which are UN sanctions only, that is, governed by the proliferation finance definitions as according to FATF, which have now been hollowed out and are hopelessly outdated thanks to the obstructionism and sabotage of the Russian Federation. So that's it in a nutshell. Back to you.
Thanks, Hugh. Staying with you for a few minutes. You started on this, but can you talk a bit more on how this will affect financial institutions, non-banking financial institutions, and other entities in the private sector, especially in those countries that you mentioned are UN-only sanctions jurisdictions?
Thank you, Ladan. In two ways. One, due to all the sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation, there's a lot more risk out there following the Russian Federation's second invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And two, the Russian Federation has been actively sabotaging the efforts, primarily within the United Nations, to be able to effectively monitor sanctions violations and report sanctions violations, which allows the private sector, say, to read UN panel of expert reports, consult updated designation lists, learn about the latest typologies and aliases used by these proliferation finance networks. So not only is the Russian Federation causing more sanctions to be imposed, at the same time, it's limiting the abilities of the UN Security Council, and indeed the FATF mechanisms, which would allow private sector actors to more effectively address potential risks. Back to you.
Thank you. And we would have to add that when it comes to banks, they worry about their dollar, euro clearing, which the banks in those jurisdictions care about and have to follow those sanctions. Over to you, Julia, now. Can you please explain a little bit about the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation and its role in implementing export controls and advancing U.S. counter-proliferation financing policy, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ladan. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Appreciate K2 organizing this webinar and for inviting Charlie and I to be here. It's a great pleasure to address such a distinguished audience. I represent the Office of Export Control Cooperation, or ECC. We are one of 4 programming offices at the Department of State's Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation. My office administers the Export Control or Border Security Program, otherwise known as EXBIS. In my office, together with Charlie's office, Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction, or CTR, administers roughly $250 million annually in foreign assistance activities that are designed to create layered defense against the illicit flow and movement of weapons, dual-use technologies, materials, and expertise at the institutional, national, and multilateral level. I want to point out that both of our offices are capacity building programs, and so we have no regulatory or enforcement role in the U.S. export control or sanctions systems. Our programs are designed to build sustainable capabilities of foreign partners, and in that sense, we amplify the activities of ISN policy offices as well as our regulatory agencies, including the Department of Commerce and Treasury. But I want to stress the fact that we don't have a regulatory role to play ourselves, because this is important. Nothing that we say here can be used as a binding legal guidance. So as I mentioned, since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, ISN programming offices have worked to complement ISN and other U.S. government sanctions and export policy actions with foreign assistance that has been focused on expanding the shareable understanding of Russian supply chains and evasion tactics, and building the partners' awareness of and capacity to implement sanctions and export controls. As you recall, and as Hugh had alluded to, 38 countries had adopted a host of multilateral sanctions. This is probably the most robust and comprehensive sanctions regime that has ever been adopted in terms of the scope. And it had been introduced gradually, sort of expanding the aperture of things that we would like to deny the Russian defense and energy sectors to prevent the Russian war machine from operating. Unfortunately, our partners had been simply overwhelmed with the scope of the sanctions and needed considerable assistance to understand what is required of them. And so both my office and Charlie's office had plugged in to provide that assistance. So our programming has included several initiatives focused on enhancing foreign government and private sector capabilities to counter proliferation financing activities involving both state and non-state proliferators. So again, going back to what Hugh has been saying, we had previously been concerned with non-state proliferators acquiring technologies that are WMD sensitive, but now we see UN member states sponsoring proliferation activities of other jurisdictions. So specifically, our program include efforts to support partner government regulators in assessing proliferation finance risks, building law enforcement capacity to investigate and disrupt PF and sanctions evasion activities, and enhancing private sector capabilities to identify and report sanctions evasion and other suspicious transactions and counterparties. So broadly speaking, my office and Charlie's office, counter-Russia programming, can be grouped into sort of 3 main lines of efforts. The first is helping partners establish export and financial controls and providing tools that would help them understand, identify, and disrupt obfuscated links to sanctioned Russian entities. Second, we are working with Ukrainian authorities and subject matter experts to analyze Russian weapons system found in Ukraine and identify critical Western components and trace Russian defense supply chains so that we can then work with the suppliers. And third, building off of the component tracing, we offer broad open source data analysis and tools to help governments in the private sector conduct customers' due diligence, identify linkages to sanctioned Russian entities that they may be trading on or transacting with, and then help them proactively investigate sanctions evasion activities. Our initial programmatic response focused, as I mentioned, on kind of building awareness of the proliferation-related activities, helping partner countries develop mechanisms to keep up with the complex and rapidly expanding array of Russia sanctions and export controls. We have worked with subject matter experts, including K2 Integrity, to develop a basic Russia sanctions training and certification program and support the initial launch of this program in high priority partners, including transshipment countries in South America, in Central Asia, and in Southern Europe, as well as Central Asia. And we have our sister office, CTR, has also rapidly expanded its outreach to public and private sector, targeting specific sectoral compliance risks as it relates to Russia sanctions evasion, because it isn't just about exporters or financial institutions. There is, of course, risks associated with aviation, shipping, and so forth. And over the past year, CTR has trained over 1,500 foreign officials on new sanctions against Russia and Belarus. And in particularly high impact financial and transshipment hubs, our offices have coordinated joint programming, bringing in the Department of Commerce and Treasury to effectively target multiple sectors and audiences. And overall, at this point, we have conducted outreach and provided technical assistance to over 25 jurisdictions. So we see, in a nutshell, that this kind of capacity building is essential to implementing and enforcement export controls and border security regulations, and limiting sanctions evasion that perpetuates Russian aggressions and prevents Russian arms diversion. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Ledan.
Thank you very much, Julia. Charlie, over to you. Can you please explain a little about how ISN programming also seeks to address PF activities prohibited under UN Security Council resolutions, namely those involving DPRK and previously Iran? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ledan, and I want to echo Julia's gratitude for the invitation to speak today. Very honored to be addressing this group. As you both mentioned, my name is Charlie Brewer, and I currently serve as the Deputy Team Chief within the Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction's UN Sanctions Compliance Program. We work very closely with EXPIS and our policy office colleagues here in ISN and across the U.S. interagency to design, coordinate, and implement several counterproliferation finance and sanctions implementation programs. Beyond the Russia sanctions work that Julia just discussed, our offices also support programs seeking to enhance partner capabilities to fully implement UN Security Council resolutions and other sanctions pertaining to the DPRK, and to counter the threat posed by Iran's ballistic missile and UAV programs. As you are all aware, the threat posed by both North Korea and Iranian weapons proliferation activity grows more concerning every day. The North Koreans launched dozens of ballistic missiles in 2023, including 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. In addition to this testing, North Korea's WMD programs, malicious cyber operations, and other destabilizing activities continue to present a serious threat to regional and international security. North Korea, as has been widely reported, also continues to supply Russia with dozens of ballistic missiles, ballistic missile launchers, and at last count, almost 11,000 containers of munitions and related material for Russia's use against Ukraine. On to Iran, its development and proliferation of UAVs and missiles continues to destabilize the Middle East and beyond. Over the past 10 years, Iran has increased its inventory of both armed and unarmed UAVs, whose low cost, simplicity of production, and ease of use make them very appealing to Russia and to other entities and countries of concern to which Iran may transfer them. To be more specific, since at least August 2022, Iran has transferred hundreds of UAVs to Russia, and Moscow has extensively relied on these to strike critical infrastructure in support of its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. These activities, coupled with Russia's recent veto of the mandate renewal for the UN panel of experts monitoring the implementation of DPRK-related resolutions and the expiration of certain provisions of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 pertaining to Iran's ballistic missile program, make maintaining vigilance within the global private sector and coordinating international counterproliferation efforts more important than ever before. It's our goal to equip partners in the private sector and within the governments that we work with the capabilities they need to effectively disrupt proliferation finance activities and protect themselves against sanctions and reputational risk. To that end, our office and our colleagues in XBIS have dedicated significant resources to working with private sector partners across financial, manufacturing, and other critical sectors to improve their understanding of proliferation finance typologies and activities, enhance customer and transaction screening practices, encourage effective cooperation with law enforcement during sanctions and export control related investigations, and expand public-private information sharing on proliferation finance threats. Our primary approach to engaging private sector on CPF focuses on sharing updated information on PF typologies and supporting partners in developing or enhancing their KYC and EDD frameworks. For many of you in the financial sector, sanctions-related transaction and counterparty screening have long been standard practice. But with proliferators like North Korea, Russia, and Iran increasingly exploiting sectors with less experience managing sanctions risk, for example, oil traders, commodity brokers, insurance companies, currency exchanges, microelectronics producers, etc., our workshops are often the first time that executives and sales staff seriously consider their exposure to the breadth of proliferation finance threats in our world today. While we continue to prioritize our work with foreign governments on improving their capabilities to meet UN obligations pertaining to North Korea and comply with Financial Action Task Force standards, as well as develop national CPF frameworks, we view our engagements with the private sector as one of our most effective tools to disrupt PF activities, because all of you are often more aware of and responsive to changes in global sanctions regimes, including those by the United Nations, the United States, the EU, and other authorities. And with that, happy to turn it back to you, LaDan.
Thank you, Charlie. Over to you, Hugh, now. I'd like to focus more on the challenges that financial institutions, banks in particular, in the private sector increasingly face. We know that proliferation finance and other forms of sanctions evasion share similarities when it comes to money laundering and trade-based money laundering, or TBML. An overarching theme for all these activities is the use of shell or front companies registered in international financial centers and even commercial free zones. These are per FATF typologies. Can you please tell us about a few more recent cases that you've worked on? Thank you.
Well, what's really important to emphasize, I think, LaDan, and you've mentioned it, is the role of shell companies, sometimes referred to as holding companies, that are registered in international finance centers, IFCs, sometimes referred to as offshore centers. So that in nearly all cases of sanctions evasion, networks operating across multiple jurisdictions, you will find a shell company registered in an IFC in that mix. And often it's more than one shell company and more than one IFC. To give you a relatively recent example of a case that's resulted in designations now and some prosecutions, we have a shell company network established by Russian military intelligence, GRU associated individual, who the company was established in 2012 with the intention of smuggling primarily dual-use goods from the United States via Europe and into the Russian Federation. And this particular network had a holding company in an international financial center in the Eastern Mediterranean, but there were also companies in the Kingdom of Sweden, in one of the Baltic states, the There was even a bank that was at one stage 5% owned by this Russian procurement network fronted by GRU agents. It was designated by OFAC in 2016. The Russian ownership of the bank was subsequently lost, but in the payment transaction data, you can see this Estonian bank being used because, as I said, it was between 5 and 10% owned by Russian nationals who worked for a company called Radio Export, which figures in US Department of Justice indictments and Treasury designations. And these guys, in addition to running a procurement network to bring in these high-tech US goods to the Russian Federation, they were also shareholders in this Estonian bank. But there were companies set up in the British Virgin Islands, in the United Kingdom, in Hong Kong, very interesting IFC. So you had a real mix in there. And what it looked like in many ways was more of a kleptocratic network for laundering funds, typical of an oligarch setup. But in fact, it was specifically designed for dual-use goods smuggling, but using the methods that the oligarchs' accountants had established some 25, 35 years ago. So with the Russian Federation and increasingly North Korea, we can see multiple jurisdictions involved, not just one international financial center, but several. And that's kind of in line with tax evasion practices that we've seen over the last 30 years, and certainly in line with the more sophisticated money laundering activities that were first really exposed within a Russian context with the Sergei Magnitsky Act and the fallout subsequent to his murder in a Russian prison. Back to you.
Thank you, Hu. And I wanted to underscore that what you said applies to North Korea and Iran too, as you just said. Thank you. In addition to the problems facing financial institutions, we've also seen the use of maritime and shipping insurance. Banks will regularly not finance petroleum or petroleum-based trade or shipping without a maritime insurance. They also rely on insurance companies for having done some due diligence on those products, on the ownership of the vessel, etc. This extends to non-petroleum products as well. However, we've seen time and again, and the UN panel of experts also attest to this, and I know your name was on, Hugh was on one of these reports, many of these reports that I've seen as a coordinator, that insurers do not conduct sufficient due diligence, especially when it comes to old clients or don't renew CDD, KYC, vessel ownership information, etc. Charlie, in your work with the private sector entities, especially insurers, can you please tell us more about your experience with this typology and other issues and challenges, related issues and challenges that you encounter? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ladan. And we'll defer to Hugh on the specifics of his reporting. But as I mentioned before in my initial remarks, the scale of international sanctions regimes treating Russia, North Korea, and Iran have demanded that many sectors go beyond the due diligence that's being applied, traditionally within the financial sector, to pay much more attention to proliferation finance and sanctions evasion activities. As you noted, this is especially true with industries critical to facilitating maritime trade in petroleum products, such as commodity brokers and maritime insurance providers. At the beginning of our work with these industry stakeholders, during capacity building engagements and policy meetings, much of the discussion that we had, I think, used to focus around identifying vessels engaged in suspicious activities, especially those that might be facilitating oil transfers to North Korea. These suspicious activities, of course, include typologies such as shutting off their AIS systems or appearing to meet with or conduct ship-to-ship transfers with vessels that have been linked to proliferator states. I will say, while fleet monitoring remains an essential element to good due diligence practices to ensure that vessels that are being insured or are otherwise connected to your businesses aren't engaged in designated activity or prohibited activity, I think recently industry partners within the insurance sector and beyond have noted that identifying ultimate beneficial ownership or management of the vessel, or other connections such as the technical manager or associations with crewing agencies, is perhaps a bigger challenge than understanding the actual movement of the vessel. So a lot of our engagement has been focused on helping partners better understand what those shell company networks look like that ultimately, manage the activities of this vessel, to help them identify those, in addition to maintaining awareness, of course, of where the vessel is in the world at any given time. As many of the participants know, vessels often change hands and are frequently leased for short-term trips, and firms that are offering insurance or other services to the vessel may not feel that they have sufficient time or information to confirm who is actually directing the activities of that vessel before making a business decision about whether or not to provide service. I would say we fully acknowledge how resource intensive it can be to conduct in-depth counterparty due diligence. However, the importance of taking the time to investigate potential new or current clients for connections to entities of concern or designated entities cannot be overstated. In our engagements with the maritime industry on Know Your Customer practices, we try our best to provide partners with updated maritime sanctions evasion typologies that they could integrate into vessel and entity screening checklists, and propose questions that they could ask during customer onboarding and information refreshers with current clients that could help expose potential connections to Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other entities of concern. I would also just say, given the increased attention that international community is paying to this issue and the amount of open source and press reporting that exists about sanctions evasion activities to date, that there are plenty of publicly available resources that could have potentially derogatory information about not only vessels, but the companies that are operating vessels engaged in sanctionable activity, that we would of course recommend that all partners view and continue to search for, recognizing that there is a lot of reporting out there that can be extremely useful during these sorts of screenings.
Thank you, Charlie. And I just wanted to, again, remind the audience that we do have documents in the docs tab that includes one document called Know Your Cargo that has some of these typologies and red flags. We also have a couple of other documents that do have these red flags and typologies in them for your reference. On to you, Julia. Now, with the coercion of the UN sanctions regime, which we talked about, and due to the unique structure of the UN Security Council, we've witnessed the creation of a so-called coalition of willing, taking on the task of international security where the UN has failed to do so. I'm going to refer the audience to a document called in the docs called U.S. State Department Joint Statement on the UNSCR 2231 Transition Day, which talks about this next issue, which is one example of this coalition of the willing is the Proliferation Security Initiative, or PSI endorsing states. The other is the the Russia sanctions regime, which we've been talking about, which with many of the countries involved, US, EU, UK, Australia, Japan, New Zealand for the first time, Korea, etc., can be a multilateral set of sanctions, so to speak. Can you explain how your team sees this nexus of export controls and trade and proliferation finance and your implementation of CFP measures, please? Thanks.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Ladan. I will just say that again, as capacity building programs, we, Charlie and my office are tasked with sort of expanding the capabilities of countries to contribute to the coalition of the willing. For multiple reasons, countries may or may not be able to take a political stance. And so we focus on developing their technical competencies in order for them to be able to take the appropriate steps should the political will allow them to do so. For my program, speaking for my program, for the Export Control and Border Security Program, as our name implies, we build the capabilities of partner governments to implement multilateral export control regime lists and guidelines. That helps our partners develop legal frameworks, institutions, procedures, and skills to conduct technical analysis of the products and technologies slated for export or transfer, as well as assess the risks of their possible misuse by by the intended recipient. So this is what we call the end user analysis. Our capacity building also includes training governments to engage with and inform the industry, primarily, of course, the exporting community for our program. But as Charlie mentioned, our programs work with a whole host of industry sectors, including increasingly with shipping, freight forwarding, and the financial sectors. And we provide information to the governments, who then provide the information to the industry about the red flags and behavioral typologies that may indicate such suspicious transactions. And so the transactions often include entities that are not yet sanctioned. And I just want to stress that even for the UN sanctions designations are almost always backwards looking, right? In order to put together a designation, you have to have amassed a body of information that supports such a designation. Once that is published, the entity in question will most likely change the name and the ownership and possibly the address and the phone number. And so making sure that we look at the typology of behavior that indicates a suspicious activity, as opposed to just narrowly interpreting the entity that has been designated by the UN, is important. And so teaching this risk-based approach to transaction monitoring. So the entities that have not yet been sanctioned but might nevertheless be involved in illicit acquisitions involving dual use or proliferation sensitive goods is what we're trying to get to. This means, as Charlie had mentioned, that financial institutions may go beyond simply implementing targeted financial sanctions called for in the FATF Recommendation 7 to stop financing of illegal procurement activities. And so we are hopeful that linking export controls and financial intelligence units will kind of create this positive feedback loop, where using export control information and screening financial transactions, as well as using financial information and export control decision making, can be mutually reinforcing, each system fitting the information into another, and creating a fuller picture of what a proliferation procurement network looks like. My program, as well as Charlie's program, provide tools that enable the governments and industry stakeholders to assess the parties to the transaction, what Charlie, I think, called the counterparty due diligence, and determine if they have links to the sanctions parties. There is a plethora of information, as my fellow panelists have described, but we recognize that condensing that information in a timely manner and making it usable for very quick decision making, especially in the financial sector, can be a challenge. So we provide tools that facilitate that decision making. So since we talked about typologies, I want to highlight the fact that several years ago, our program worked with King's College London to develop a PF typologies report, a copy of which is in the docs tab, to identify typologies of proliferation financing that may be relevant to the financial institutions. We have also previously funded commercial screening software providers to provide subscriptions to the governments with whom we work, to be able to give them access to the kind of expedient information that has already been sort of condensed and pre-screened for them. We also work really closely with the U.S. interagency, including the Departments of Commerce and Treasury, Justice, and Customs and Border Protection. And to give a very practical example that's relevant to today's discussion, the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce has developed a list of 50 common high priority items identified by 6-digit harmonized system codes that Russia seeks to procure for its weapons programs for use in Ukraine. And so we have, my program has organized activities that sort of create a forum for the BIS experts to highlight to the various industry sectors that these items pose a heightened risk of being diverted illegally to Russia because of their importance to the Ukraine war effort. And we coordinate with other assistance providers to make sure that again, our partner governments, as well as their industry sectors, are well informed of what those 50 common high priority items are, and integrating them into their screening software, into their customs targeting software, to make sure that there's multiple layers of defense to prevent those items from leaving the jurisdiction with which we're working. So I wanted to highlight another element of kind of how we expand the coalition of the willing. We, for example, work very closely with our European counterparts. There is a program of the European Commission that's called EU Partner to Partner Program, which conducts outreach on dual-use export controls. And we coordinate both at the strategic and the tactical level with them. And as a result of our biannual dialogue, we have the European Union Partner to Partner Program has stood up its own proliferation financing training as well as sanctions outreach program. And so this expands both the coalition of the willing, but also the kind of assistance that we can provide to countries seeking to obtain additional information and take positive steps in that direction. So I just wanted to say that that kind of continues to help strengthen the impact of our capacity building on sanctions. Over to you, Ledan.
Thank you very much, Julia. Now, to both of you, Julia and Charlie, I keep reading in UN POE reports, maybe rest in peace, that we no longer see Iran raising funds or engaging in trade or dual-use restricted goods just for Iran, but it's doing so for DPRK, for Syria, Russia, etc. And we also see more use of PF networks, not just AQCON network, but others and other non-state actors as well. Can you please tell us some of what you see as the trend towards PF networks? Thanks.
Thanks very much, LaDon. I'm very happy to take a stab at this one, Julia, and then would welcome your views. I think, as I mentioned before, the increased collaboration that we're seeing between Russia and Iran and Russia and North Korea not only reveal new types of proliferation financing activity that the private sector needs to be aware of, recognizing that many of these partnerships, are new and involve entities that previously have not been, designated or actively tracked as being part of proliferation networks. But really, I think the message that I would send to industry stakeholders that might only be focused from a business perspective in certain regions of the world is that while some countries or industry may have considered the proliferation threats posed by Iran or North Korea or Russia to be kind of primarily regional in nature, that they are no longer that way, that this interconnection between proliferator states means that we truly need to take a global perspective towards managing sanctions related risk and proliferation finance risk. Unfortunately, that does require, significantly more investment in understanding these types of connections and keeping an eye out on, global proliferation finance and sanctions evasion trends beyond one specific proliferator. But Julia, over to you if you have anything else to add on that.
Nothing significant, Charlie. I think you've covered it well. And, just looking at the time, I want to make sure that we leave enough time for participants' questions and so forth. So.
Thank you both. Just on a quick note back to Hugh, can you tell us more of some of the recent cases you've worked with that involve US, UK, or EU entities violating or being used to evade US, EU, UK sanctions? Thank you.
Gosh, where to start, Ladan? There's so many of them, unfortunately. I'd rather hit a positive note before we go into the questions, as I saw there are a lot of banking compliance officers watching this. And what I'd say is throughout all these investigations, perhaps more than 100 over the last 2.5 years, what's impressed me going out to conduct outreach, do expert technical exchanges with banking compliance people is how impressive some of them are. Banking compliance community is very interesting. For a start, there's more gender balance there than I've seen, certainly within the United Nations, particularly within the panel of experts. You see women as AML-COs, deputy AML-COs, special investigations officers. So it's a lot fairer like that. I'd also say that while, UN member state officials move on, rotate through positions, through the foreign ministries, through the interior ministries, banking compliance people tend to stay in position once they've moved there. So they can build up an expertise. And remember being in a Baltic, an EU member state on the Baltic, and just being so impressed by the compliance officers there. It was a couple of years ago. They knew the UN reports inside out. They knew the annexes. They knew the names in the annexes. They'd become, if you will, experts. And that's what I think is so important now as we go through a paradigm shift, is for banking senior executives to realize that sanctions are the canary in the coal mine. They're the litmus test. If your bank is detecting and blocking sanctions evasion networks or sanctions proximate individuals, then your financial institution is likely in good health. There will be less money laundering going on. The senior management will not have larger than usual risk appetites. Truly, if you look at the banks that have collapsed, that have received very serious fines over the last 5 or 6 years, certainly in Europe, that have been subject to scandal, underneath almost all of these cases, you will find sanctions evasion networks, whether they are North Korean, Russian Federation, Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's a wise investment by senior bank executives to give their compliance teams the time and space to develop their skills as experts, because anybody now in Europe, North America, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, anybody now who is pursuing sanctions enforcement knows that the financial institutions are the first line of defense, and so much responsibility is being given to them. So that means the compliance teams, they need the tech, but beyond the tech, beyond the databases, beyond the tools, they also need the time to develop their expertise and that recognition. And I think that's the most important thing that I've learned over the last couple of years is like the invaluable work of these compliance departments. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. We're going to go over to the questions, and this one is to any of you who want to answer it. Have you lately detected activities of PF activities in Latin America? Don't jump up at once, anyone. Go ahead. Go ahead, Hugh.
Well, I have to say I haven't been lucky enough to focus work time and visits on Latin America recently. I would point out, though, from the US Treasury designations in relation to Russian sanctions, you will see a number of Russian, Belarusian individuals who also held passports of an EU member state. They were sanctioned for, among other things, for trying to sell Russian Federation and Republic of Belarus military kit to UN member states in Latin America. So that's an often forgotten theme, whether we're dealing with missiles, whether we're dealing with helicopters. The Belarusians and the Russians are quite keen to sell to different UN member states in Latin America. And this is an ongoing activity, which is subject certainly to sanctions introduced by the United States of America and I believe other G7 members. Over.
Thank you, Hugh. Charlie, you wanted to go ahead?
Sure. No, I just to add on top of what Hugh had mentioned, while I can't speak to any specific cases involving Latin American jurisdictions, I think the question does raise, a very important point, which is that no region of the world is immune from proliferation finance risk or activity, and that given the complexity of the networks often involved in facilitating financial flows and making procurements for proliferator states, that regardless of your geographic proximity to a country subject to UN or other sanctions, does not at all mean that you should not be paying very close attention to potential proliferation finance activities that may be occurring within your jurisdiction. So I would say to participants joining from Latin America and from all over the world, this truly is a shared problem and a shared responsibility.
I
Thank
would like to, sorry, I'd like to echo what Charlie is saying and to say that with respect to the Russia sanctions specifically, again, it isn't just the industrial sectors or specific companies. There has also been a whole host of individuals, Russian political elites, the oligarchs that have been designated. And so their assets, including their, very ritzy vessels, are often docked in some maritime, shipping jurisdictions. So this is something, again, without naming names or identifying specific countries, I think something to look into for any potential sanction evasion activity.
I'd also like to add that when it comes to Iran and especially North Korea in terms of proliferation financing and revenue raising, first of all, cryptocurrencies and those assets do not have any boundaries. So that's being done and being hacked into all countries all over the world. So don't forget about revenue raising, and it's not just trade finance in this. And also don't forget that Latin America hosts, the Golden Triangle problem is still there, and where Iran is very active and other countries, proliferating countries. Hugh, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yes, I thought I should just add, especially within the context of North Korean sanctions, but also more widely, if you read the older panel reports, you will see that there were North Korean diplomats, attaches, trade representatives popping up in different parts of Latin America, in some UN member states where there is a registered diplomatic presence, and in other places where there was not, including arms brokers over the last 20 years. So wherever you have, a diplomatic presence of a proliferator, that's really a red flag. And although banks often do check and exercise enhanced due diligence when it comes to embassies and diplomats in general, it's really worth remembering just who has embassies throughout Latin America, and a track record of trying to facilitate various forms of trade, both some more licit than others. Over.
Thank you. And also, thank you for reminding us. And FinCEN also issued an advisory lately about IT workers or DPRK workers who pose as IT workers in some countries. And that's another one. So on to another question. I know that Julia will love to answer this one as well as Charlie. To what extent can responsible UN member states sponsor or provide sanctions and monitoring mechanisms to mitigate forthcoming knowledge deficits in banking and finance due diligence efforts caused by the recent Russian hampering of UN monitoring groups?
So I'm happy to just make a couple brief comments on this one. The United States is committed to working in good faith with all members of the Security Council, as well as other member states, to implement UN Security Council resolutions and to work towards our shared goal for the DPRK to abandon its nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, and ballistic missile programs in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible manner. I would say, as to specific UN monitoring mechanisms, I don't have any particular guidance to offer at this time, but to go back to the earlier discussion we had about the importance of open source and media reporting on sanctions evasion activities in the environment where the UN panel of experts on North Korea is no longer in a position to publish reporting on DPRK sanctions evasion activities, the role that organizations that do investigate and publish information about proliferation finance activities, it will be more important than ever before. I know both for my office and Julie's office, we work with a number of organizations that do a lot of investigations in this space. And I imagine that as we continue to make investments in the activities of those organizations, that hopefully the amount of public reporting on North Korean and other proliferation financing activities will not diminish despite the cessation of the activities of the panel.
I will also add to what Charlie is saying that, recommendation one, FATF recommendation one provides a super useful tool where both governments as well as private sector institutions are now obliged to undertake a risk assessment that would identify their potential exposure to risk of proliferation or sanctions evasion. So making sure that those assessments, first of all, take place, and to the extent that there are, government representatives on the call, that they take place in the interagency manner and bring in all of the relevant government as well as industry stakeholders, and that those assessments are published to inform your industry of the potential exposure to risks that they should be aware of and integrate into their own monitoring mechanisms. I think that will be a very effective tool. I will also make a very shameless plug for the fact that our programs do accept donations from other UN member states. We work very closely with, as I mentioned, the European Union as well as the governments of Japan and South Korea. And so if there are other governments that would like to stand up their own programs, we will be happy to share information or expertise. Or if you would like to contribute to the activities that we're already undertaking, we will be happy to work with you as well. Over.
Thank you. Now over to you, Hugh, on there's another question here on the issue of PF networks. As far as the Russia-North Korea connection goes, are there also linkages being seen that go through the People's Republic of China?
Well, just to comment on that last question, I think it came from a chap called Lawrence Demodi, who himself worked for the UN panel of experts as a consultant. Hello, Lawrence. I hope you're well.
Hello, Lawrence.
We remember you fondly. It's a good question. You can read the FinCEN reports, which show that the People's Republic of China is, I think, the third jurisdiction on the list in terms of a transshipment and a manufacturing point for US investigations based on US correspondent banking data. It's a FinCEN report from October 2023, which is open source. People's Republic of China, I think, is position 4, and then it's followed by Hong Kong, SAR. So yes, clearly, in terms of global trade, China is extremely important, has been extremely important for the Russian Federation's market, for the military industrial base to procure goods, which are dual use or proliferation sensitive in nature. So in terms of trade, yes, it's extremely important. I mean, I would defer to the US government, but from what I can see on the battlefield in Ukraine, the only items that I can see that the Chinese have supplied the Russian army are these little buggies. They look a little like golf carts. They're not proper all-terrain vehicles, and they have no armor protection. They look pretty awful to me. I wouldn't classify them as military goods. So that's all I've seen in the photographs. But in terms of dual use goods and market share, People's Republic of China has been very important. Over.
Thank you. There's another question. The banks are good at detecting anomalous activity and reporting it, but the national FIUs and prosecuting and judicial authorities are under-resourced and under-skilled, so SARs are not investigated and there's limited enforcement. How is this being resolved?
Well, it's not being resolved in most cases, unfortunately. Then this is why the compliance heroes, the compliance officers are the real heroes. Especially if you're in a jurisdiction that does UN sanctions only, that adheres to the FATF ones, which leaves you with North Korea, essentially, and an outdated designation list. What are you to do as a compliance officer if you come across something that you think is related to Iran, possibly proliferation? You can't even file an ASAR with the FIU because the FIU won't look at it. And the problem is worse than that. Even in some EU jurisdictions, the FIUs are saying in EU jurisdictions, don't send us any SARs or STRs that involve designated entities. Only if they've been engaged in money laundering will we look at it. So this is another reason this phenomena, under-resourced FIUs and FIUs who are not willing to accept SARs, STRs subject to US sanctions, UK sanctions, EU sanctions, or other G7 sanctions. So it places the onus on the compliance officers again, and it puts other financial institutions in these UN sanctions only jurisdictions at more risk. Because unless you have an informal information sharing network that cuts across all the financial institutions in the jurisdictions, then the smart compliance officer who's identified what he or she feels like a suspect shipment, blocks the transaction, or even recommends the account to be blocked, they have no way of communicating that high-risk client, that high-risk transaction to all the other financial institutions in the jurisdiction. And that's what makes the lives of compliance officers so difficult, but makes them even more important because of that lack of support and that terrible backlog that the FIUs are facing. Over.
Thanks, Hugh. Just before we go on to answering this question more, I just wanted to let you guys know that we've reached time, but we're willing to go past it if you have time with a bunch of questions that we'd like to answer. So with that, we'll go on to if Julia and Charlie wanted to answer that. And I just wanted to, in defense of some FIUs, I want to say that some of them do say that they don't have a sanctions mandate, but they only have an AML mandate, but completely agree with you. Go ahead, Julia.
Well, this is a perfect segue into what I was going to say. Again, I'm not as despondent as Hugh, in part because the reason that Iran and DPRK are on a FATF blacklist is not because of their proliferation connections. It's because of their terrible AML regime. And so if there is anything else, we have seen a great convergence of threats in that respect as well, is that if you're identifying proliferation financing activities in your jurisdiction, you sure as heck have significant AML gaps. And so there is a way of maybe addressing the problem without focusing on the specifics of proliferation. Focus on AML risks, and you will most surely identify other related issues. And so I think there is a way to kind of look at that without focusing too much of whether my SAR says, PF related activity. And with respect, and Charlie may jump into this as well, with respect to how the capabilities of the judicial sector and the prosecutors are being addressed, our programs are working with partner governments in that specific area, recognizing that it's under-resourced everywhere. I most certainly if the Department of Justice folks were on the line right now, they would say that they don't have enough resources, and we probably put the most resources to this problem set of anyone in the world. So we try to provide the skills and the capabilities. We have jointly developed an PF investigations course that we have launched in a number of jurisdictions, and so we're aware of the problem set and are trying to the best of our ability to address it with the limited resources that our programs have. Over.
Yes, to just expand a little bit more on Julia's remarks, specifically a lot of the engagement that we have had with law enforcement partners and prosecutors in foreign jurisdictions has been focused, especially in those that lack a broader kind of criminalization of evasion of UN Security Council resolutions, or just the criminalization of proliferation finance in general, is to help them identify ancillary crimes that proliferators might be committing in the act of financing their proliferation that have nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction or weapons at all, that they could use to charge those cases and have some sort of disruptive effect. That even if they're only bringing a case for bank fraud or some sort of other violation, that nevertheless that is something that is raising the cost for proliferator states and dissuading them from targeting specific jurisdictions that may not have a comprehensive counterproliferation finance law in place that enables them to kind of most effectively counter this activity. But Julia and I's team, are also, to the extent that we are able to find the resources to do so, providing assistance to jurisdictions in developing legislation. But as all of you on the call know, that's a long and time-intensive process, and oftentimes we need to find shorter-term solutions with many of our partners to disrupt PF activity in the absence of some broader criminal code to do so.
Thank you, Ulf. Another question is, what is your opinion in enhancing the communication between correspondent banks, ordering bank, and beneficiary? I assume it's originating bank and beneficiary bank, so that the cycle of money is more easily tracked? I'm assuming that you're talking about how to track the illicit flows. I'll let whoever wants to answer this go ahead.
Well, I would step in briefly to say it's an extremely interesting and timely question. For me, it's particularly interesting when we look at jurisdictions where, let's say, the financial institutions there, their compliance teams don't have the sophistication, the experience, the exposure to sanctions evasion networks or money laundering typologies, so that if there was a way for, say, the communications with the beneficiary bank or the ordering bank to issue some kind of alert or to ask further questions, say if it looks like the client is a grey arms broker and one of the financial institutions isn't aware of that fact, but the other one is, because it can see it has familiarity with the typology involved. That's difficult at the moment because, typically it's FIUs that are meant to communicate between each other. But it's a really good point, and I think enhancing the communication with correspondent banks is really useful and is something that correspondent banks can do more unilaterally. And we hear that this is being done a little more than it used to. But it's a really good point. That's an excellent question from Stiliana.
And I also wanted to add, thank you, Hugh. And I also wanted to add that we do have a course that we've also worked with Julia's group on in terms of risk. In terms of both sanctions risks. And one of the things that we talk about is we have some scenarios that we usually have in these courses, and we go through that. The problem is, one of the problems that has been happening now, especially with Russia sanctions and with one of the things you have to understand about correspondent banks is that they have hundreds of thousands of transactions happening a day. So they rely on their respondent banks in those countries to have more understanding of their market. And so if they see something that goes through and they stop it, they will have, it's good to have that information sharing and discussions with the correspondent bank. The other problem is that it's always never just beneficiary and originating and a correspondent bank. There are various others in between, but it's always good to have that conversation and to understand that better, and to also understand that the correspondent bank relies on you to understand your own market better and to have done your due diligence on your customers and your customers' customers for these issues. So I'll just leave it at that, but say that that's a very good question, as Hugh said, and we can expand on that more. There's another good question that says, AML experts often heavily rely on the organization's established risk response framework, sometimes at the expense of not exercising independent judgment. How can they be empowered to make more independent judgments during risk assessment? Before anybody answers, I just want to say that one of the main things that, one of the main pillars is for the excellent compliance departments that Hugh was talking about, is to have the support of the management and the risk, the tone that they have, and a culture of compliance throughout the institution. So if you have those, you should be able to address some of these questions that you're talking about, but I'll let somebody else answer the rest of this question. Thank you.
So it's a very good question from Henry there. I mean, my advice would be, pick your battles, and to choose to step outside the framework when you are 100% sure. And the consequences of not stepping outside the framework, not exercising your independent judgment, might be really bad for your institution. So if you pick your battles by that means, then the more you step outside the framework, the more people, senior managers, your line manager is going to listen to you, because the first few times you did it, you were bang on the money. So it's a really good point. and it's just a question of choosing when to do that. Over.
But I think the issue of the management support is super critical, right? You know, to what extent is the you know, your bank's leadership or your organization's leadership is prepared to say, you know, we don't want to work with the gray arms brokers. You know, those are not the kinds of clients that we want to have, and we will, you know, put the trust in you to weed those out. How much leeway is given to the compliance officers to conduct that due diligence, you know, during onboarding or subsequently, to make sure that the entities that are being serviced by your financial institutions are still maintaining their good credibility and reputation, and are not besmirching yours by association.
Thanks, Julia. All right, Nicole is asking, what are your thoughts on criminalization of PF? Is that a positive or negative step? And I just want to add, there's also criminal law as well as civil law. So go ahead, anybody who wants to answer that.
I can say a few things, and Charlie can certainly add. I think the only country of which I'm aware that has criminalized PF sort of at the outset as a predicate offense is France. I'm not aware of any other country taking that step. We unfortunately have not conducted analysis to see, you know, sort of how much that has helped or hindered anything in France specifically, because, you know, France is frankly not one of the countries with whom we're engaged in terms of assistance providing. And so it's hard for me to say. It's a very, as Charlie said, any legislative development is a very time-consuming process, and it takes a long time, and could get mired in, you know, election cycles and other, you know, sort of externalities that have nothing to do with legislation itself. And so I think from our perspective, it's important not to get hung up on getting that. If you have other ways of kind of accomplishing what you can accomplish working within the legislation that is already existing. And thank you for the question, Nicole, and for participating. Good to see you.
The only other thing I was just going to add, you know, without touching maybe on the specific language of what a criminal statute criminalizing proliferation finance would look like, I think the broader point that we wanted to confirm was that making sure that governments have some sort of legal capability to disrupt activity that is actively detrimental to their national security and international security is critical. And in many cases, you know, simply having in place the mechanism to fully implement the FATF recommendations and the targeted financial sanctions pertaining to North Korea would not be sufficient in several, you know, many cases to curtail proliferation financing activity that directly involves entities that have not yet been designated by the UN. And so I think having jurisdictions think very carefully about how to scope the tools that they may wish to have to prosecute proliferation financiers beyond that list of entities is really important to kind of future-proof your response abilities to make sure that you're not in a position where proliferation financing activity is happening within your jurisdiction, because of the way you wrote your legislation, you're unable to effectively pursue it while it's happening.
All right, thank you. Our last question comes from Rita. Are there some real examples where law firms were subject to proliferation financing risks? I'd just like to add that lawyers, accountants, company service providers, our trust and company service providers are what FATF refers to as gatekeepers. So these are the ones who also facilitate the making of shell and front companies. Go to Hugh, I guess, if you want to answer that question, or if there's anybody else who would like to answer that, can go ahead.
Yes, over to my other panelists.
Oh no, I was feeding you an answer. I was going to say the Mossack Fonseca is probably the most famous example, recent example of a law firm being embroiled in proliferation financing activity. But of course, and you know, there's wealth of information. I'm not going to belabor all of that here. You can find ample information online. But that investigation turned up all sorts of illicit activities and shell companies and so forth. And Hugh could probably give greater gravity to that case study.
Well, it's a very good example, Julia, and very open source, and again, operating across multiple jurisdictions. And of course, Mossack and Fonseca, they had all these international partners, law firms, accountancy firms in so many other jurisdictions, to the extent that I've read FATF or Moneyval reports saying that lawyers and accountancy firms, even just mentioned in the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, that's enough to trigger an alert and a possible inspection by the compliance teams that are so diligently monitoring the law firms and the accountancy firms out there. Over.
Thank you very much. And it also, as you said, multiple jurisdictions, and that answers the question about Latin America as well. And so thank you very much, Julia, Charlie, and Hugh, for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you again to everyone for joining us. We hope you've gained value from our discussion. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Institute for Financial Integrity for hosting our discussion. Their next webinar will be focused on countering corruption. Please expect a follow-up email in a bit, including access to the recording, as well as a few other resources for further reading. We hope to see you again soon on our next webinar, and thank you again for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.